think he underestimated the quickness and speed of Trey Newton on that play.
Most of you probably know what's about to happen here on this play. One play between Texas quarterback Colt McCoy and Alabama defensive back Marcel Darius is going to drastically alter not only the course of this game, change the journey that this two teams involved have had to go on to get here, but it is probably going to also define the careers for both of these two players involved going forward. Texas fans and Alabama fans know exactly where I'm going with this. But, you know, the story behind this game, and especially of one of the teams playing it, is pretty interesting when you think about it. It's not just a college football game, it's not just a championship game. It's the culmination of a long season journey between both these teams. But for one team, this is the end of a journey that started 3 years ago. Or I could say 4 years ago, if we're going to go back as far as we're going to go. And now it's all come to a head here in the first quarter of this game. But before we go into this play and all it means, I think it's time that we go back a little bit. Welcome to the channel. This is the story of the 2009 Texas Longhorns. Let's go back a bit before we get to this particular game. Let's go back to the last time the Texas Longhorns competed in a national championship, in particular, the last time they competed at the Rose Bowl.
4th and 5. I kind of feel like Joe. I'm too old for this. 4th and 5, the national championship on the line right here. He's going for the corner. He's got it.
Texas fans will forever cherish this day. 2006, the Texas Longhorns, led by almost Heisman winner Vince Young, just conquered the actual Heisman winner Reggie Bush and the USC Trojans in the 2005 national championship game. Many people, myself included, feel that this is the greatest college football game to have ever been played. And I honestly don't think there's been a game since that has matched that game's intensity, that has matched that game's drama, all of the storylines that felt like something out of a movie. And it certainly ended like that, but in a different way. It ended with the underdog conquering the big champion, even though the main character of that storyline was USC. The Trojans were the main focus of the storyline, and Texas came in out of nowhere. But now it was Texas's turn to be in the spotlight. And it would all start with their following season. They needed the quarterback to help follow up Vince Young, who had had an amazing season, had led their team to a national title for the first time in over 30 years, and certainly helped the Texas Longhorns become a new powerhouse in college football under his watch and under the watch of head coach Mack Brown. Thankfully, at the time, they did have their succession plan already in place. Mack Brown had a full scholarship quarterback on the bench, who was at the time redshirt freshman Colt McCoy. Yep, Texas fans know immediately where we're going with this. We're going to go through the first couple of chapters pretty quickly because they are kind of just setting the stage for what's really to happen in that 09 season. But let's start with the unfortunate hiccups in defending a title. The 2006 and 2007 Texas Longhorns certainly weren't national title contenders yet, though that's to be expected with a freshman and then sophomore quarterback in Colt McCoy, who was still kind of getting his legs under him, hadn't really fully grown into his role yet. It's to be expected that maybe not everything was going to be perfect, at least to start out this title defense. And certainly it wasn't. Texas would lose 6 crucial games in those 2 years, including some blowout wins and upsets to Big 12 rivals that would end up costing them a chance at even competing in their own conference championship game. 2006 was a little better though. The Texas Longhorns that season finished with a 10-3 record, a Big 12 record of 6-2, and scored 467 points that year while only allowing 238. That was 229 overall margin of victory over their opponents. So it wasn't that bad, including the idea that they finished 6th overall in offense in the country. With a freshman at quarterback, that's not bad at all. They also finished 26th overall defense. Now granted, that's out over 120 schools. So it's not great, and it's not bad. It's alright, they're in the mix there. Colt McCoy had a pretty good season that year, finishing with 217 completions out of 318 attempts, which was 68.2% completion percentage, 2,570 yards, which is 8.1 yards per attempt, 29 touchdowns, 7 interceptions. Not that bad. He was also 5th in completion percentage. He was tied for 9th in touchdowns in the country, and he was 8th in the country in efficiency. Not a bad start for Colt McCoy. This was a team that was very talented and very good. They just need some time to grow into their own. And next season, not so much. The 2007 Texas Longhorns really did take a step back. Now on paper, it wouldn't seem that way. They finished with a 10-3 record, and they won quite a few games, including dominating a lot of their Big 12 foes. But the devil is in the details. They would lose 3 crucial games to end up knocking them out of any chance at competing for a conference title, losing 41-21 at Kansas State, 28-21 in the Red River rivalry to rival Oklahoma, and losing 38-30 to Texas A&M. They also took a step back, whereas they did score 484 points throughout the season, which was more than they had scored the year before. They also allowed a total of 329 points, though that is 155 points in terms of a positive point margin, but still quite a step back for that defense. They finished 45th in overall defense and 14th in overall offense. They finished 45th in overall defense, which is certainly a step back, 19 spots down, 14th in overall offense, which is 8 spots dropped. Might not seem too bad, but then we look at the quarterback Colt McCoy. He certainly had quite the sophomore slump, if you want to call it that. 276 completions for 424 attempts, for a 65.1% completion percentage. Not great, not terrible. 3,303 yards, 7.8 yards per attempt, 22 touchdowns to 18 interceptions. He threw 7 less touchdowns, but he threw 11 more interceptions. That's not good at all. In fact, Colt McCoy was listed as one of the most disappointing players of the 2007 college football season, as many people expected him to take almost a Vince Young step forward as he had done throughout his time at Texas. And Colt McCoy, that's not good. In fact, this was the first time and the only time in his entire college career that Colt McCoy would not finish top 10 in any passing category. He finished 6th overall in interceptions. That's it. But the only thing he was high in was 18th in the country in completion percentage. That's honestly about it though. He did not finish top 10 and he dropped everywhere else across the board. So certainly a down season for the Longhorns, and people were wondering if Colt was the real deal. Thankfully, this is where things start to pick up in the next chapter of our story. (2008). The 2008 Longhorns were certainly a team to be reckoned with, and it was Colt McCoy's best year in his entire college career. They finished 12-1, ranked 4th overall in the country at the end of the year, and they finished with a Big 12 record of 7-1. So if the college football playoff had existed back then like it does now, they would have been able to compete for at least a shot at the national championship game. Now, how would they have fared? Hard to say. They really stepped it up this year, scoring 551 points total on offense, only allowing 244. That is a 307 margin. That is incredibly well done. They finished 5th overall offense, 19th overall in defense, which is a 26 spot improvement. Not bad for a pretty young defense, full of a glutton of young talented players. But Colt McCoy, he was the catalyst for the reason that offense finished 5th in the country. Colt McCoy would have his best season by far, having 332 completions and 433 attempts with a 76.7% completion percentage, 3,859 yards, 8.9 yards per attempt, 34 touchdowns, 8 interceptions. He finished 1st in the country in completion percentage, 5th in completions, tied for 9th in touchdowns, 3rd in efficiency. He was top 10 in almost every single passing category. Except, of course, for interceptions, he wasn't in that category at all. But in terms of like all those positive categories, he finished top 10 in almost every single category, including top 5 in more than 3 of them. Also, he finished 2nd in Heisman voting. He finished right behind Sam Bradford, who would go on to win it from Oklahoma, and Tim Tebow from Florida, who would go to win one of his own. So basically, Colt McCoy had thrusted himself into the upper echelon of college football. He had taken the Texas Longhorns on another step. In fact, many people speculated that Colt would be selected in the first round of that draft, and he should have probably gone along with some of his teammates, but he elected instead to stay one last season. Now, the big reason why is that he had deeply held values, and he believed that he could help win the Texas team a national title. He would help them recapture the glory that they had once held with Vince Young, and he truly believed that it was time for him to accomplish that goal. And if you want to know more about those details, of course, you could look up Flemlo Raps' video on what happened to Colt McCoy and his whole story and everything there, because I go into more details there. I highly recommend checking that out. But basically, Colt McCoy was determined to stay true to his commitment. He wanted to win a national championship for Texas, and he felt like now they finally had the team to pull it off. And especially with him taking a step forward, it was time for him to go win. Now, of course, quick little side note, we can't mention the 2008 Texas Longhorn season without mentioning that weird 3-way tie controversy between Texas, Oklahoma, and Texas Tech. That weird little side gig that ended up, of those 3, Oklahoma ended up being the one that ended up going, despite Texas Tech upsetting Texas, who was number 1 in the country at the time, in the crazy 39-33 game. But I think those are 2 separate stories for 2 separate videos, because those are two separate things, kind of their own story, and I can't wait to talk about them then, and I'm sure I'll get to those videos another time. But yeah, that is a weird little sign up, that 3-way tie controversy that ended up Oklahoma going up to the Big 12 championship game, where they would end up pretty much just demolishing Missouri. But now we finally reached the meat of the story, the 2009 Texas Longhorns. The 2009 Texas Longhorns. So now some of you may be asking, why are we only getting to the 2009 season now? Well, like I said, the story of the Texas Longhorns isn't just of the 2009 Longhorns, I should say, isn't just in their season. It's what led up to it that made 2009 such an important year. All of the drama that had led up to it, including with their quarterback, Colt McCoy. Now it was time for all of that to finally come to fruition. In 2009, they looked to be on track to do it. The 2009 Texas Longhorns would end up finishing with a strong 13-0 record going into their national title game against the Alabama Crimson Tide. They went 8-0 in conference play, by far their best since the 2005 season. They had incredible standout victories, such as 59-20 over UL Monroe, 41-10 over Wyoming, 64-7 over UTEP, 41-7 over Missouri, 41-14 over Oklahoma State, 35-3 over UCF, 47-14 over Baylor, 51-20 over Kansas, and 38-14 over Colorado. In fact, of the 13 games that they won that season, 9 of them were by an average of 39.3 points per game. It was the best. That was the 3rd most in the country. They scored the 3rd most points in the entire country that season. In fact, they'd improved. They had scored 550 points that season in total, only 1 point less than the previous season, but allowing 234 points against, giving them a 316 margin of victory. That is incredibly well done. In fact, so with the fact that 9 of their victories came by an average of 39 points a game, including 2 games where they won by over 50, it looked like Texas was en route to win their national championship game. Colt didn't have as strong a year though, but it didn't matter because this was a Texas team that was built to go deep into the season. He had a 70.6% completion percentage, completing 332 passes of 470 attempts, 3,521 yards, which is 7.5 yards per attempt, 27 touchdowns and 12 interceptions. He was first in the country in completion percentage, third in completions. He was 11th in passing yards and tied for 10th in touchdowns. Fun fact, the guy that finished first in the majority of those categories ended up being Houston's Case Keenum. Didn't expect that now, did you? In fact, he ended up finishing third in the Heisman voting that year, and the winner, we'll get to that in a bit. In the 2009 season, this Texas team outscored opponents 417 to 109. That is incredibly well done in those 9 games. Yeah, you heard that right. In 9 of the 13 victories, those 9 blowout wins I was talking about, they outscored those 9 opponents 417 to 109. That is very well done. 308 point margin. That's absolutely insane. And we've seen some pretty good offenses since then, but what this Texas offense was able to do, unfair. Not to mention, this roster had quite a few standouts. They had Colt McCoy, obviously, at quarterback, but they also had future NFL wide receiver Jordan Shipley, who ended up being a very good friend of Colt McCoy and ended up being his favorite target. They had future wide receiver Marquise Goodwin, a very good wide receiver, and is a pretty decent one, especially in San Francisco. They had future automatic kicker Justin Tucker, who, say what you want about kickers, but Justin Tucker, he's as good as they come. They also had Alex Okafor, a future defensive line Pro Bowler who just recently won a Super Bowl with the Kansas City Chiefs. And they had future Legion of Boom icon Earl Thomas at free safety, who was just a sophomore at the time. So this roster had quite a few talents on it. And they were of course headed by Mac Brown. They finished 3rd in the country in overall offense, 12th in the country in overall defense. This 2009 team wasn't quite as good as the 2005 unit, but it looked pretty loaded. So it looked like Texas just cruised their way all the way to the Big 12 championship, where they won their tightest game all season, 13-12 over Nebraska. Now, it should be noted that the Nebraska Cornhuskers at the time had the number 1 ranked defense in the country, so it was going to be a battle no matter what happened. But Colt McCoy and Texas were able to edge them out, which is a very good job done by them. This season and this Texas team looked geared to raise a crystal football at the end of the season. Not to mention they had also won 3 huge games against their rivals, winning the Red River rivalry over Oklahoma 16-13, winning against Texas Tech 34-24, and winning a shootout against Texas A&M 49-39. I know I'm telling you a lot of numbers and statistics here, but it's all just to prove how well put together this team really was, and how good of a job Mac Brown did coaching this team. This 2009 Texas team, probably you could argue, was the best team in the country. Well, almost. Going into the Rose Bowl, it almost felt like the same story again. Texas labeled as the underdog, despite having an excellent season themselves. Why were they the underdog this time, though? They weren't facing Matt Leinart, Reggie Bush. They weren't facing a loaded team like that just won back-to-back national titles looking for a three-peat. They were facing the Nick Saban-led Alabama Crimson Tide, who had gone 14-0 that year, or at least 13-0 up to that point. They had gone 13-0 that year, 8-0 in conference play. They had 449 points for, but only 164 points against. They also won games by an average of 32 points per game. They dominated their opponents. Their standout victories included Florida International 40-14, North Texas 53-7, Arkansas 35-7, Kentucky 38-20, Ole Miss 22-3, Mississippi State 31-3, Chattanooga 45-0, Florida 32-13. They were 21st overall in offense in the country, but they were second in defense. And they had just come off two pretty big high emotional victories. They had upset Florida in the SEC title game, beating Tim Tebow, and that now infamous photo where Tebow was seen crying on the sideline. They also were able to beat Auburn in a very close Iron Bowl game in which Alabama fell behind early but had to come back to win. This Alabama team was certainly no slouchers. Not to mention, here are just some of the future NFL talents that would end up playing on this Alabama team. Dre Kirkpatrick, a cornerback who was a freshman. Junior safety Kareem Jackson. Sophomore linebacker Mark Barron. Another sophomore linebacker in Dante Hightower. Future defensive line Pro Bowler Marcel Darius, who becomes a very key player in the story, as discussed in the beginning. A sophomore wide receiver in Julio Jones. A freshman running back named Trent Richardson, and didn't work out great in the NFL, but he was still really good at Alabama. And Heisman Trophy winner Mark Ingram. Mark Ingram had a monster year that year, and he was the first guy to ever win the Heisman Trophy in the history of Alabama football, which is kind of insane given the amount of players that have come through their school since. So now we have our matchup set. Texas, Alabama. And it feels like Texas USC all over again, because Texas is the overlooked challenger despite having an excellent season. Everyone's talking about Alabama, and the Longhorns are determined to do it again. The second drive, it gets different. The second drive for the Longhorns, they onside kick the ball. Now, we have seen coaches pull gutsy moves before. One example actually is with the Super Bowl. Remember when Sean Payton and the Saints were going up against Peyton Manning and the Colts? They decided to onside kick at the start of the second half, and that was the turning point of that Super Bowl. Texas onside kicked in the second series of the game against Alabama. This is still in the first quarter. They recovered the football. And now, it just felt like that Texas had all the momentum on the sideline. And Colt McCoy is leading this team down the drive. He's showing that Texas speed. And then comes the infamous play that we discussed earlier. Now, we're going to go back a little bit ways again. Colt McCoy had some injury concerns, and in his sophomore year, he'd gotten sacked quite a bit during that 2007 season. But the 2009 Longhorns really didn't get hit that often. They made sure that he was well protected. They did not want him taking a lot of punishment. That's what made Colt such an effective passer. But it should be noted, Colt McCoy has struggled with injury concerns throughout his entire playing career. Not just college, but in high school as well, and it would also go on to later affect him when he went to play in the National Football League. But nonetheless, Colt McCoy was still determined to lead Texas to victory. But this is that infamous play. Roll the clip.
Now the option look, and Colt McCoy bangs into an offensive lineman who was being pushed back. Time, defensive player for the Tide. There he is.
Yeah, big hit Marcel Darius in this football game against this kind of offense. Marcel Darius is the best Alabama defensive lineman as far as hitting pressure.
Colt is hurt.
One hit from Marcel Darius, everything changes. They end up losing Colt McCoy for the remainder of the game. It looked like he suffered a severe injury in his shoulder. He couldn't even lift up his arm to take off his helmet. He wanted to go back in, but he was unable to. And unfortunately, Texas wouldn't recover, losing 38-21 to Alabama. These 2009 Texas Longhorns were certainly a team that had championship potential, but couldn't quite reach the end of it. This 2009 team had such a efficient offense. Their defense was cataclysmically good. They knew how to turn over the ball. Their offense was just lighting it up left and right. Colt McCoy leading the way. But unfortunately, this Texas team, this was no match for Alabama without their signal caller. And it does show a very interesting story in college football. We've seen this before. We recently saw it in 2019 when Alabama lost to Tagovailoa. We've seen teams that have the potential to maybe win a national championship, but then lose their quarterbacks to injury, and nothing's ever the same. Or they lose an important piece. But what makes this 2009 team so interesting to me is that it's not just the 2009 season, it's, as I've said, it's everything that led up to it from the previous years. It felt like the years that they had spent molding and carving this team, building them up as a bunch of young players, letting them grow and grow and grow, letting them become this really high caliber unit, only to end up short. Unfortunately, the sports landscape is littered with stories like this, of guys who just do everything they can. They do everything in their power. They grow, they build, they do what they can to make themselves the best possible player or team possible. And unfortunately, it is not enough. If Colt doesn't get hurt in that game, maybe Texas wins this championship, and then maybe we're talking about a very different story about how the 2005 Longhorns helped championship to help maybe the 2019 win one of their own. Instead, we're talking about a 2009 team that could have had a very similar story to the 2005 Longhorns, but unfortunately ended up watching another team raise a crystal football, and it wasn't even their own fault. Texas fans, I'm sorry if I've awoken any agony in you over the course of this story, but please let me know your thoughts on this story. I would love to know what you thought of this 2009 team. Maybe Texas fans, maybe you can give me more insight on what you thought that this 2009 team could have been had it not been for Colt's injury on that speed option play. And maybe if this team wins a national championship, it also maybe greatly alters Colt McCoy's career, because his career after wasn't exactly smooth sailing. But, of course, that's going to do it for this story. I will be back with another video soon. I have a few topics in mind. Please stay tuned. Anyways, that's going to do it for this story. This is Caleb Alden, signing out.